Hey guys, Mrs. Kraz here. We're going to look at Chapter 17, Section 2 today, Native Americans Struggle to Survive. So before the West was transformed by boomers and the railroad, the people we saw moving out west to develop it, it was home to many Native American groups, and the groups living out west can be referred to as people of the plains. Taking a look at their ways of life, people of the plains gathered wild foods, they hunted, they fished, they tamed herds of wild horses, they used guns to kill greater amount of game or animals at a time. They used something called travois, I could be pronouncing that wrong, or small sleds to travel if they had a nomadic lifestyle. Not all plains people did have nomadic lifestyles. They lived in teepees, or cone-shaped tents made of buffalo skin. They followed buffalo, which were used for a source of food, tools, thread, you name it. All this goes to say that the people of the plains had a culture that was very different than the modernizing culture that was developing in the West in the 1800s. Looking at gender roles in plains tribes, men were hunters and warriors for the most part. They were the religious leaders in the community, and they often made pledges to the Great Spirit. We'll look at that a bit more in class. Women kind of took a management role when it came to life in the village. They cared for children, they prepared food, they made clothing and teepees. Women were able to fight in wars, which is different than what was going on in traditional American culture at the time. So now looking to the American government's interaction with the people of the plains. So the American government wanted plains tribes to stop following buffalo and settle down in one place. If that's done, right, then the government knows which land is available for settlers that are moving out west. So the government issues the Fort Laramie Treaty, which states, among other things, there's a lot covered in this treaty, but one of the pieces is that if a tribe settles down in one place, their land would be protected by the government. Great, sounds good, right? Native Americans have been pushed off their land by the American government for decades. A promise that their land will be protected, well, not too bad of a deal. Except the government itself quickly broke that treaty and allowed settlers to move onto Native American land. There was a gold strike in 1859 that brought a large amount of prospectors into Native American territory, in Colorado particularly. So moving on, this shouldn't sound surprising. When Native Americans were forced to leave their lands after being promised that those lands would be protected, they get angry and they retaliate. And one way they retaliate is by attacking supply trains that are headed west. They want to stop goods from getting out there to the people who need them. And they even start attacking American homes in the west. So we have an American general, an American colonel, Colonel John Chivington, who attacks a group of Native Americans in retaliation. The Native Americans raised a white flag declaring peace. They weren't going to fight anymore. But ultimately, Chivington's men killed them anyway. And this comes to be known as the Sand Creek Massacre. We'll take time to look at this more closely in class. Another thing we'll be looking at over the next few days are Buffalo Soldiers. So Buffalo Soldiers was the nickname given to African-American men who had served in the Civil War and then came west kind of looking for a fight. Buffalo Soldiers waged war against plains tribes for 20 years. It's a complex system. We'll examine it. Bear with me. Speaking of buffalo, so buffalo herds began to shrink throughout the 1870s. And there are two main reasons for this. So in addition to the Native Americans that had been hunting buffalo, we had railroad crews who had hunters killing their buffalo, and then they could use, or killing buffalo in general, and they would use the meat from those buffaloes to feed their crew. Some people kill buffalo in order just to make money off of their fur, and the bad news here is that a declining buffalo population means there are declining resources for Native Americans. Obviously not a good thing. It's going to be harder to survive with a food source and just general resource for your people being cut off. So we said that the government wanted to see Native Americans settled in one piece of land, and now we have the American government forcing Native Americans onto reservations, or land set aside or reserved by the government for Native Americans to live on. We get Colonel George Armstrong Custer. He was hired to help move Native Americans from the Little Bighorn Valley onto a reservation. He did not take a peaceful approach to this. He brought 100 men, and he did so violently. It wasn't a peaceful relocation, if such a thing can even exist. It was a battle. So Native Americans fought back and defeat Custer and all of his men. About a year later, more American troops return and slaughter many of the Native Americans that were involved in this. This is another piece that we'll look at more in class. Aside from physical war, there are other ways that different Native American groups would try to resist the move to reservations. So the Nez Perce fled towards Canada in order to escape reservations. Many were captured near the border and forced to surrender, forced onto the reservations anyway. The Navajo raided settlers' farms for livestock. Settlers started a war with them, won, and sent the Navajo away. Looking at the Apache, many like Geronimo waged wars to resist going to reservations. Many lost and had to go. I think you're getting the gist of where this whole slide is going. It's not upbeat. There was something called the ghost dance. So some Native American tribes believed that doing a ghost dance would let them commune with the dead and would bring back a time of peace without the settlers. So literally, it's just dancing, hoping that it will let you get in touch with your ancestors and peacefulness. A battle was held to end the dancing. So, was this the inspiration for Footloose? I don't think so, but we do have wars being waged over even peaceful movements, or battles, I should say, being waged over even peaceful movements. We're getting a lot of attempts by Native Americans to be free, to live their lives the best they can, and we're seeing them squashed immediately. So there were some people who wanted to see reform, people who acknowledged that Native Americans were not being treated well and changes needed to be made. So for instance, here are three. Suzette LaFlèche's father was an Omaha chief. She wrote articles and gave lectures that told about the poor treatment of Native Americans. Helen Hunt Jackson was a poet inspired by LaFlèche, and she wrote A Century of Dishonor. We're going to take a look at a passage from that later this week. And A Century of Dishonor discussed the many treaties with Native Americans that were broken by the American government. And last but not least, we have Alice Fletcher. She promoted rights for Native Americans as an agent for the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs. And all three of these women, I think we could say, really thought that by bringing awareness, making people aware of the problem, right, making sure it's publicized, making sure people know exactly what's going on, they were hoping that the American public would then support them in aiming for reform. So the last slide for today looks at the Dawes Act. This was passed in 1887, and it was developed in order to get Native Americans to settle down in one location, again, that's the goal, and become farmers. So the Dawes Act gave Native American males 160 acres to farm. They set up schools for Native American children. These seem like good things, but ultimately the Dawes Act failed. So few Native Americans took to farming on the land that they were given, right? They were given land that wasn't very arid. It wasn't good for the crops they were used to growing. They weren't ready to, they were incapable of growing successfully on this land. So most wound up selling their land in an attempt to make money, but they sold it cheap and they kind of got swindled by whoever bought the land from them. If you took some of this land, instead of responding to tribe leaders, you had to respond to federal agents having control over you. That is not the way Native Americans were used to living, and of course the federal government has not been very kind to them, so why would you want to listen to a federal agent? And if you were now farming these 160 acres of land on your own, traditional ways of life like traveling and hunting buffalo were no more. So we're seeing that Native Americans were definitely hurt by what was going on as the West was being built up from an American standpoint. We'll look more closely at this impact over the next few days in class. Have a great afternoon, people.